Hello everyone, we're probably exaggerating with question and answer videos, but this means that there is an interest towards my channel. I keep getting certain very ever more interesting questions exactly about the things that I come up discussing, mostly in the Terrain playlist, so in a sense a philosophy of history or something around that, and mostly also gravitating naturally around military history and how to study that specifically, and how this, what criteria, which standards should be kept for this. So, sometimes, these things are objectively important, also beyond the typical history video that I make, right? And I'm screwing up the routine, but I'm plenty of those, right? Instead, I can't make an infinite of them, but I also treasure your own curiosity about other aspects that maybe I do not explain, particularly that maybe are more interesting for you aside from those other ones. So I got actually a private email. Naturally, I'm not going to reveal the name, even certain aspects of these email that are, let's say not private, but not necessarily have to do with the question. So I'll skip those. But fundamentally, here it goes by, "Hello, sir. I stumbled across your videos while searching for information on the army of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. I sought out this information because I wanted to better understand what my army in the video game Europa Universalis Fort might have looked like. I was astounded by the detail and rigor which you packed into your video and began to explore your other content. When I found it was on the same quality, I subscribed." So thank you a lot for that. And so he goes on. I'll be paraphrasing. It says, that he was always interested in history, and he, that this thing means a lot for him, and then that however, he's not pursued a scientific, say, academic career. And then he goes back to the fact that I recently watched your analysis on the historical accuracy or lack thereof of battles in the Total War series. You speak in that video on the rigor that is necessary to truly understand history and, by extension, the world around us. And then he says basically that as he liked history so much, that the exposure to my content was like, it made him feel a sort of difference in potential, saying, I need to know much more of this, right? I want to know because I found myself as if I had missed something. And so he concludes by saying, "This roundabout exposition circles around these two questions. As a matter of fact, is it possible to pursue a rigorous understanding of history outside the realm of professional academia? If so, how? These questions have been swirling in my mind since watching your video." And this is interesting. I'm truly passionate about these things, and am willing to pursue anything within my means to achieve a deeper understanding of them. So first of all, thanks for the nice message, and congratulations if you have such interests, if you feel so much driven. I don't know how old you are or anything. I guess it doesn't really matter, but especially if this is at an early age, you can be early as even your 20s. Let's say you may want to think whether this can bring you forward. And this message, as actually I could answer you by saying that I made already videos about these topics, even some actually dedicated exactly to this. That is to say, is it possible to acquire a skill, a capacity, and understanding about history in this case specifically, let's say, without a formal, in this case, tertiary education. Now, in the subject, of course. So what struck me with this message is, however, how the things were put together. That is to say, first of all, the story, because I'm interested, even for the sake of a strategical analysis of my channel, other things, how is that people actually get into my content, and eventually, what effect does this have, and why they decide to follow, and what is that I can do to to improve that, to kind of to satisfy that curiosity, like in this case. And because it starts from the fact that you got into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth videos, that I don't know which one it is because I made multiple of them, and I made most of them some time ago at this point, when I still had even more linguistical difficulties than now, and that I don't treasure as some of the best videos I've made in general, and not because they were bad, probably they were well done. It's just that in that case, as I will explain now, it's not that I'm really an expert on the Polish-Lithuanian military. I've expanded naturally my own knowledge partly through the same videos themselves when I had to prepare them, and so most of the things I talk about, I'm not really that expert on. At least that my standards are significantly lowered when I make these videos, meaning that if it depended on me, I would like to study in detail like everything, like I do for my specific field of expertise. And what I told multiple times is that, of course, nobody can be expert about everything, of course, but secondly, that there is naturally always, by the way, a level of approximation that is exactly what we that is a bit an illusion, right? For those who know less, it seems you know that much if you talk about these things. If you know more, you realize that they're somewhat poor stuff, and there is nothing wrong, right, in being in either position. Like the important is how much naturally we're willing to do more and how much we know. Like the beauty of history is the beauty of the world is that there is no human that actually. Say every human knows something that another person in the world doesn't know, right, by some standard. And the same goes for history as well, right? So we all learn from each other, and I definitely also learned from people who studied these things way more thoroughly than I will ever do in my life. So we'll get by steps there. But the interesting thing there that I caught the attention with the video also, so this was a subscriber who eventually got into the last video I made some days ago about the how realistic are Total War series battles, and where basically I applied a sort of, in fact, of that military logic deriving from my comparative and diachronic analysis of military history for studying the art of war. That is essentially what I do on Schwerpunkt, essentially, and in my life, in ways that I also would like to do much better, but that I try to be vocal about, because I don't see I don't see an attention towards these things. They're literally the most important ones when you want to approach certain topics. So that's why I talk about them. Of course, I feel always challenged not to be not to do enough in that field. And so that's mostly where the rigor probably stemmed from, meaning that aside from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth video that was probably loaded with details and some kind of nuisance of criticism, whatever. There is what I'm developing in these years is properly an interpretative pattern, right, or better method for approaching the art of war, right? And of course, I am aware here the author uses, for his feeling, when he poses his videos, I felt it being kicked into the valley of a Dunning-Kruger graph, right? As if you would go down, say, as soon as you're flushed with this information, saying, wow, there is that much to know. Yeah, so this is a compliment to me, but I'm very glad about that, and I'm even very glad about that feeling, because I'm not a sadist, but it's exactly what I'm trying to achieve through my videos, right? To sensitivize people about such the fact that there is something that we already know that we don't put out there most of the time. We don't make people aware, and that instead has a universal language that it should be also self-evident, because logically, rationally, you are even if we all fall short that at some degree, that is something that everybody can understand, and to improve, right, understanding our analysis of reality, right? So I I will not comment maybe on the first 2 points. Let's say the first one, as I said before, it's just I can't even say how I put that video on Polish Lithuanian military together. I will keep talking about that, by the way, at some point. So, and maybe I can explain my method, how I make these videos, etc., in another video, right? But partly I will address the same thing, but answering to these two specific questions. That is to say, is it possible to pursue a rigorous understanding of history outside the realm of professional academia? And if so, how? Right? And this is also a point that I care very much about, because I feel the inherent tension, right? The inherent struggle. It's something that I feel myself when I realize that maybe, yeah, you see, when you specialize so much in something, it's always a double-edged weapon, because you of course increase your knowledge in a certain specific field, but you start understanding that the time and energy that you have put in it is also subtracted to the understanding of other very important things that exist in the world, in every kind of scientific branch, and that you should actually know. Like, I've been feeling this a lot, especially compared to when I was younger, when I was much more polymatic in practice, because I liked very much history of philosophy, history of literature. I liked even physics. I liked even there are certain math problems that say, yeah, high school programs are so useful, you just work. I always criticize people for not being so, but I realized that I'm forgetting those things and how I used to do them, right? And I realized that this is an important dynamic, because not only I feel as if I've done that thing, I kind of know how it is, and of course if I were reacquainted to it in a decent way, I would learn it in a quick sense. But let's say the fact that I'm forgetting about that is something disturbing, right? This happens also with the same history. There are things you learn years ago and say you become kind of proud of, and then you realize over the years that, what was that thing, and you remember how much you liked that and how proud you were that you had learned that thing that you would never forget, and then you start forgetting. And it's kind of disturbing from one side, but it makes you understand also how this game of perspective, as the author of the question points out, can be mind-blowing, right, for everybody. And so naturally Schwerpunkt provided me now with this daily exercise for years, for which I could exercise my mind, speak about these things, and probably not even that dramatically effective as I would like to be in it. But I think it's still, it's again, I talk a lot about, if you're interested specifically in this broader view, because if you were struck by the let's say my rigor in terms of what you should do in terms of attaining a discipline, how to use the scientific method, how, etc. Well, the best, like the most theoretical part of this, that is how I lay out explicitly what I'm doing, is in the Historian playlist, right? Which is a playlist where I essentially insert all of these specific theoretical questions or some broader concepts that I think about history. There is a lot of stuff there, and it's in chronological order, because I haven't been re-uploading those videos. They were all fine. I've been re-uploading lots of videos now. It's not important, but let's say there is also the evolution of my thought, because I didn't think the same when I started Schwerpunkt, and my thoughts were much more primitive, right? So there are literally acquisitions that now, year by year, I realized to have acquired, and I'm kind of accelerating in the process as well. So, which is good from my perspective, but also have to be aware not to get a tunnel vision and saying, this is effectively what matters, without effectively doing it, without effectively, even testing or considering other things, which is very dangerous, right? This is the concept of the intellectual superiority, right? I don't consider, I have a great sense of superiority in a sense towards lots of people, but not in the way it's usually thought. Let's say I think to be better just by default. I think that I realize from the base of a formal, scientific background, at least, that I reached some places, some levels, let's say, where a very few people have, right? And I can see it where when I talk with scholars as well, right, there is always something that I have to learn from them about other things for which I'm grossly ignorant, and I am definitely, like we all are. But let's say in certain specific ones that I've been cultivating for years, I do think that I have something to say that is worth listening, because it's kind of better, and or at least it exposes people to, like in this case, to something that I had never quite acknowledged per se, and that can instead be useful. Because if I get this message, it's not just about that I got a new subscriber and I'm pleased, and of course I always thank all of you for all my support, etc. It's because I think that this concept that I came up with, if it is properly explained, it can be exported and it can benefit people, right? So I have this drive. As you know, I felt challenged. I have had moral strains because of all reasons that are partly connected to this view of the world that is also partly alienating myself from most people, in a sense. Not because I'm more or less isolated than before, but because I realized that I'm becoming intolerant to certain lack of consideration, right? And so whenever I find somebody who says, you know what you're saying here makes sense, I think it's important, it's interesting, I want to know, I want to do better on my own, well, that's the goal for me. I have received mails like these when people said that they started university because of my videos. But those are the things that make me go on, right? And so I don't feel superior because I it's myself, that I don't really open up very much. You don't even know who I am, where I come from, and all these things. But it's about the idea, right? And not an abstract idea, a quite concrete one, right? One that you need to make things work. So, and this question touches just a part of this sphere, but it's in a sense poignant. It's crucial. Is it possible to pursue a rigorous understanding of history outside the realm of professional academia? So, like in all my view, and I think the mindset that one should have when coping with this question is it's always ambivalent. It's always both things at the same time, right? There are standards, but because there is theory and practice that you have to put together. That is probably one of the most difficult things that we're faced now, civilizationally speaking. I see it within myself too, that I have a lot of theory. And of course, my work as a historian is mostly theory in the sense that I study essentially things that happened in the past for which I can't be there, right? Otherwise, right? And so I could have become military. I could have even, in this sense, commanded in combat, all these things. And so at that point, I would have provided with input. But let's say, for von Clausewitz, these two things are somewhat at the same level. That there is a higher quality, and almost that in of course in direct command on the field. But if this is not integrated with military historical studies, it cannot be quite perfect, right? And von Clausewitz makes it very clear in this, and the answer is like, is it possible like to even be a good commander? Is to say acquiring strategical culture just by studying history. And the question is, it's very rare, right? I personally don't know and don't think, especially, that I would be a good commander, right? I have no ways to say that. At least my there are certain considerations now, without quoting the Faulkner, let's say, that make me think maybe characterally I'm not. That is to say, that especially at certain levels, it becomes ever more difficult to be that person. That being in a general, you must really be a very extraordinary human being, right? So we don't feel really bad for being excluded by such a narrow pool, let's say. But in order to answer the question, yes, in theory, you could arrive to an understanding of warfare that could provide you with that strategic awareness and education that is required to understand war as a whole. And as a matter of fact, commanding is something, right? So to be effective as a commander is something, because it involves certain neurocognitive capacities that also, nobody actually knows before they're tested in actual combat, right? You cannot say that because, I don't know, in fact, you study history or play video games or make reenactment or whatever, that you actually have just, that you would be a good commander, right? Because, again, that's the same reason why we have a military, and why the civilization has developed along that pattern, because exactly without that you cannot have the necessary qualities to make things work. Many people delude themselves they can, right? I don't with myself, but I also understand something else, which is, aside from commanding, of course, we have arrived to a point in history where, of course, military historians, at least the few good ones that exist, do actually understand war better than the military. And I'm not kidding about this. That is, even in here, you can know how to command paradoxically, not necessarily having a broader understanding of war as a phenomenon, scientifically speaking, right? So this falls into the broader Clausewitzian understanding of war, and how this is transposed also on the studies. Von Clausewitz was both. He was both a general and a military historian, so he knew definitely what he was talking about after a life spent in arms and studying at the same time. So definitely a person that you are not, whoever you are, listening. Von Clausewitz topped a certain level that at this point nobody has ever come even remotely close or possibly close. Some level. This is also not something to be despaired of, given that we have the Funkriege, so we should be just thankful of that. And this is just maybe a little sponsor to my own to my own reading and commentary of the Funkriege that I made on the channel. That is to say, that possibly the most important thing that you should do in order to understand such rigor is passing through the perfect combination between theory and practice, that is, in fact, on war, that is von Clausewitz's work, right? Because there are set some standards that are not just, theoretical. I mean, they are moral, they are scientific, they are historical. There is a dialectical example, there is a logical example. We're talking about a rationalist view, and at the same time, something that has fate, in fact, in understanding, almost definitely in the idealistic level, that is comparable to the level of development of the philosophies of Kant and Hegel, and so much, right? That is the background you should come from when you study the Funkriege. And so I would say, if you really, here I don't know what, because the question starts with the Polish-Lithuanian, on the army of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So I understand that there is a military historical understanding. Also, the video game, that's the other thing, that the video game Europa Universalis, right? I never played it. I know what it is. And I found it very interesting that such interest, again, because I talk mostly to millennials, right? I see it from the stats on YouTube. And so I know that we passed through that phase of our lives when we played video games, whichever they were, and we got fascinated with history, with war. Actually, that started with me very early on, and probably with lots of other kids in the same way. But say that passage reinforced, in a sense, our own approachability, our confidence in the approachability in a scientific way to history and war, like in this case, right? So even if the question is not specifically military oriented, I would say that it is important at that point also to assess how that thing is important, because studying war, it's not like studying fashion, right? With all respect that I have for any kind of historical branch, it's obviously history. It's the history of everything, but at the same time, there is some more difficult scientific standard to attain when you try to study the war phenomenon. That is, at the same time, the ones humans are most directly called to make a positive difference in, as a also relatively circumscribed, in terms of command, at least properly of strategic action, in a very concrete way, and at the same time, the one that exactly for this reason has the greatest level of unpredictability under the realm, in fact, of under the realm of the most practical thing that humans can do, right? There are much greater changes in history that cannot be traced, but on which you're not even supposed to have a control of. War is instead the one where you are required the strictest discipline, the strictest let's say, rational understanding, albeit being by definition still the one that you can understand the least its outcome, foresee the least its outcome. So it's the one that requires, in a sense, the greatest amount of intelligence in a way, and it's not a surprise that military historians mostly, or at least more than any other branch, I believe, in any other discipline, and I'm serious about this, those who have the least dogmatic and most rationalistic background, right? And there is no doubt of it, especially when you study war for real, and the art of war, that is to say, not just war, how most military historians today, self-styled military historians, define themselves, is war in the sense, let's study the propaganda in war. That's not quite like that, right? Let's study the logistics of war. That's not quite the same thing. If you want to understand war, you have to study the art of war. This is to say, you can't circle around like new military history has tried to say, that war is important just because of political and social consequences that is in function of those. No, the military dimension in the Trinity has a dignity of its own, and it's aimed at the physical annihilation of the enemy, right, concretely speaking. And if you do not know how that is factually carried out, if you don't study how armies were actually commanded and they work in the field and how they change over time, exactly because for that specific purpose, and of course all the influence they receive from the outside, you cannot claim to know what war is practically, because war is something so nebulous in our culture that is just evokes negative feelings and emotions, and this kind of catastrophistic, emotionalistic approach to it, that is the main reason why we also keep screwing up so badly with it. That is to say, there shouldn't be any prejudice toward war in the first place, and secondly, if you really want to understand what war is, you cannot but understand what factually war is, that is how you make it. War is violence by definition, and how you exercise this violence. So you cannot but pass through the Formkriege if you're really interested in that. And I've been talking for a long time also about von Clausewitz. Again, in this terrain playlist is full of that stuff, and there is the Formkriege playlist full of that stuff. And what I do in the other videos is sometimes it's just history, general history, so that I fundamentally talk about politics, society, and war. So that's the Trinity, the Clausewitzian Trinity. And of course I do have a, even there, I use a method, because military history is not studied in this sense with the due rigor, in fact. And so most of the history we're told often lacks very important pieces, including, in fact, the military one that counts for a good third of all human civilization, and that can completely, this, let's say, disproportion our perspective on politics and society in ways that we don't understand them either if we lack that, and vice versa for all three. So there are other videos where, such as the one on the Polish-Lithuanian army, for example, that is mostly an organizational, a video on armies organization. Then I talk tactics in a more theoretical sense. Then I talk about battles in a more practical sense. Then I talk about unit types. Then I talk about the broader philosophy of war, some also from an anthropological point of view, of cultural point of view. So I try to present it like 360 degrees in a way where I can really have a broader, comprehensive synthesis understanding of it, right? Because our brain is meant to do this, right? It's just that it's normally against our concept of, of the prevalent specialization, hyper-specialization drive that essentially sectorializes knowledge so much at the point we don't understand pretty much about why we're even doing this thing, and that then when you're not, in fact, you haven't pursued, as you say in the message, a professional academic career, you don't even know where to turn for a good understanding. Like you may read one thing, but then exclude all the rest as a context, as a background, and therefore maybe yes, that single thing, but then You don't realize why, for example, you have an opinion on it, whether it's correct, whether it's not. And so what should be this rigor about, first of all, according to the question? Because there is let's say, an asymptotic trend in this, that is, there is here in the infinite, here in the truth, right? So all we can do is to push toward that direction, and obviously we will never reach it, not even minimally, but still, it's important to have done something in the first place. So the more you go on, and the more you grow in that kind of qualitative sense, rather than increasing quantitatively your knowledge, you understand that your brain is making a qualitative work of discrimination to provide you with a much better insight on certain specific things. So the question, more practically, is it possible to achieve such rigor in historical understanding outside the realm of professional academia? And if so, how? So it's a bit like a single question altogether. Well, my opinion is that it is possible, because I would say no if it depended on just my vision of the thing, meaning that the question may not even make sense. I mean, the question does make a lot of sense, but the question itself, in front of what one should be able, in terms of moral force, to reach by motivation, etc., goes beyond this. That is to say, if you really want it, of course you can. The problem is that we all form our path in ways that also others do not understand. I had the honor to be acquainted to a military history professor who passed away, and that, in my opinion, was, and I say it, you think that I'm a bit mythomaniacal, which is something that I hate, frankly, and that I always fear to spot in others. That is, I'm not lying. According to me, this was the greatest modern military historian. I will not reveal his name. And he's the person who really made me understand what military history is, right? And by proxy, meaning that, I even knew the guy at some point with but let's say it was even a neighbor of mine. But the question is that he exposed to us like a dialectical model was actually motivated from the Clausewitzian one, and also he had an enormous understanding that he had cumulated not as a strictly historical professional. He had actually taught at university, but he wasn't a historian. So my understanding of this, since I haven't done the same path, is that, of course, it is possible to be an intelligent person who has studied a lot, and that has especially expanded a lot in an autonomous way, especially in history, because history is really like this, right? If you're an engineer, of course you need practice, but let's say what you have learned in as a theory remains fundamentally that one, where you can, if you are particularly gifted and you push forward, I guess in every field, of course, you can expand, you can bring another view, etc. But let's say also the practicality of that field forces you to cope with other mechanisms that are a bit much more wired to the real world, at the point that you may also not quite grasp the importance of an autonomous theoretical expansion just by default, right? You are always much more wired to a practical solution that is going to find for you, if you want to be successful, that concrete application, right? So that is in part, of course, what we should nurture, I don't know, an engineer like, because that's how we improve our capacities in that field. For a historian, it's very different. With a historian, if you don't actually learn constantly, you cannot achieve anything. Like many, even scholars that I know, etc., learn sectorially in ways that are almost like either, first of all, they get sucked into hyper specialization, so mostly they're occupied just by that, and they get the tunnel vision, they don't expand anymore, so they also become practically wired to that. But let's say, as I was saying before, if we don't expand in a comprehensive sense, that is reading even things that have nothing to do with our period of specialization, but just for broadening our mind. We are going to remain stuck in certain places that do not help to improve this rigor, right? So my experience with that guy was that he had studied, because we didn't know much about his life in the first place, but that he had obviously acquired some kind of very good education. I knew him. Even just talking to him, you could understand he was very developed, right? He had received even a good education since he was little, right? You can understand the way he spoke, the way he addressed the things. So there was there a base that, again, I know it's hard in today's time to say it, but again, if you didn't get much of a education at that early in time, you cannot really be even particularly successful in the first place as an individual. That doesn't mean that you cannot become a millionaire or anything, but in terms of that understanding, right? There are certain things you have to do in life, and the older you become, the more difficult it is. I was relatively satisfied of my education, but I go on every day saying, damn, I could have done so much more, and if I had done it at this point, I would be much better, right? I would be capable of so much more, and I don't. So that mental mode of saying I should always improve myself, like never giving up to the idea that you can be a better person, is in terms of moral drive, probably the single most important thing ever, right? Not flattening to somebody else's standards, but simply to be willing even to say, I'm going to learn this for free, right? Not necessarily because I have to have a career. And it's obvious that such rigor it derives from situations where you can afford that in a way or another, and not everybody can indeed. And that is not to be given for granted in the first place, because are we willing to do that? Are we willing to dedicate ourselves full time to something that for some reason we believe, because it's going out there in the unknown, right? But it may be the best investment ever if you manage to achieve that level of understanding. So I'm not saying that I am rationalistically planning this in my life, but I mostly am driven by the fact that I love doing it, because I've seen that it works for me, that it works for my understanding. It doesn't work because I have, career expectations. It works because I see that every time I use this method, I use this rigor, etc., things reveal themselves. It's as if I didn't even have to make, it's not quite true, but let's say an effort anymore, because what seemed in perspective so problematic at the beginning to understand, and you wondered about, actually today I wouldn't even pose it as a question, because by having learned other things, I would have simply gone beyond at that point. So I know it starts sounding something pretty weird and almost probably you think I'm a narcissist or something. I can assure you that I'm a very plain, kind of regular, like average person, even mentally speaking, intellectual. I never thought myself to be a particularly intelligent person or particularly. I dislike the idea of considering myself an intellectual, because I'm not. I believe that there must be an action, and that this is action. That is not just reading a book like you're a person who doesn't do anything. It's actually taking an important action, something that is much more sacrificial in nature than it seems, if you consider what you could do by doing something else, in terms of what normally our culture thinks reward comes through. And so I don't know even how to explain this, right? So I believe that academia is important for acquiring such understanding, because this understanding stems from a method, right? So I cannot lie by saying, it doesn't really matter whether you haven't received that formal path, because I could give you hope, right? I could read this message and say, this person has been, it's been nice, spent this time, is subscribed, is a support, etc. I could say, yes, of course, you can achieve whatever you want. Yes, you can, but this goes for the moral drive. Then in practical terms, there are certain things you have to be willing to go through and to actually go through that are very difficult to acquire without that professional capacity, right? As I was saying before, you can maybe be, let's say, why is it formal education is important? Because it provides you with that structure, right? It teaches you in theory. Because I know that academic standards are sinking at some point, but this is not it's something we are all losing, right? So this is not a matter of attaining a certain rigor just in relative standards to be better than somebody else. This is about having, an objective, qualitative capacity to understand things from a scientific point of view that should have an absolute value, right? And right, science doesn't quite have fully, let's say, an absolute value, but you can approximate it in the way it matches with reality. So, the path that you go through to formal education is aimed at even presenting you with difficulties that the same system doesn't provide you with a solution for. This is kind of strange. That is to say, for example, when you make a doctoral thesis, and I started my series on that, so I can explain these things a bit more in depth, and that from there could come kind of a model for paradoxically doing the same thing but outside a formal education, because at the end of the day, it's just you convincing yourself in doing something that you're doing just because you're in that formal education, because there is a lot of expectation from you in that field. But that is something you could easily do. I mean, you could, maybe not easily, and this is exactly the point, but you could do yourself if you had enough drive to do it, right? And to produce the same level of thing. Naturally, again, there everything is mediated, you're not flattered. Let's say nobody teaches you how to write a thesis until you do it by yourself, right? And then there is hopefully somebody who corrects you, who shows you how things should be done. But let's say there is always a component of your work that stemmed from the fact that you were alone out there and you had to make it work in a sense. And there is always also the element that the corrector doesn't actually see, that you are maybe insecure of, because but I didn't actually make it the best way. I have some doubts about that. But and so this is in part the same sap of that scientific quality, because it makes you realize where the problem may lay, and you may be the only one to see that, right? So that for example, how to improve your own work, right, in ways that maybe others do not understand. Maybe others are not even able to understand your work at some point. But this difficulty is uncertainty. How to write, like how to remain for making a years-long research without having ever made one and not knowing what the outcome is going to be before you have done it, right? In terms of what are you going to find in that research? You don't know at the beginning, so it's kind of terrifying. So you're presented with a challenge that effectively civilization should pose to you. That is to say, what are you have this problem, you don't know how to do it, you wanted to do this research, you should know what this thing was about, and so you should solve the problem by yourself. Of course, the system can help you if you ask for advice and all these things, but at the end of the day, it's only you who does the thing, and that's in fact why that's the ultimate step in that hierarchy that makes you at that point formally eligible for being like a professor or somebody with an academic ambition and so on, because in theory, if you have passed that, by approximation, our civilization has decided that this is somewhat enough, right, to teach others. And the results can be very different as the researchers and the people are, and the motives and the expectations. So I cannot tell you exactly what is that can motivate you to get there. But yes, in theory it is possible. It's just that by personal experience, I would think that I've never met anybody who would make that kind of research, right? Not even the aforementioned best military historian in modern times that I've met, because I realized, for example, that even though he had a dramatically greater understanding than mine, a greater military logic, Of course, in my own field, because I studied much more in a much thorough way, I knew more than him and approximated less than him, and had another vision simply because he hadn't passed through that, and because he wasn't even a historian at the end of the day, right? Which can mean a lot of things, not always the same one, but still, that there is even there, discipline, an order, a struggle that I think most people are not willing to put themselves under in order to achieve that. Because it's always about the reward. Like, why would you shut yourself down for 8 years at home just to make a work that effectively nobody is really even taking into account, because that wouldn't make even a formal educational title, of some sort, right? There are some geniuses that are able to this, that are eventually recognized as such, but we're talking about hundreds of years ago, when literally education was just like very autonomous, very private. Also, the same scientific standards were not the ones we have, also the historiographical ones we have to do now. So the question is that I'm very concerned of, that is, what's your goal, right? Because the goal should be commensurate to it. If you think that there is a shortcut, I'll be very, open about this, stern but fair, I hope. If you think there is a shortcut, right, for which there is a magic formula that makes you say, okay, can I understand history without having really passed through the formal education at the same level that formal education? The question is, you should be motivated and rewarded the same way that achievement would do. That is to say, if you don't want, if you say this because you don't want to struggle enough as much as those 8 years spent in constant learning for no formal recognition, and therefore, I think people just think you're strange and make you frustrated, and still I don't see where that motivation would come from. So that rigorous understanding. So I'm not saying this as a criticism to the question. The question is excellent, and I think it's the greatest problem we're facing right now. I think you nailed the point. This is exactly what we all want. That's the same thing that I wanted in order to achieve this level, right? And incidentally, that professor was a person that wasn't a particularly successful one, but that we all knew what he had done. So I arguably never found a more motivated person than that one. I should have understood him much better before he died. But I think that to answer that question, I could ask somebody that part of his family, but let's say maybe it sounds a bit too cynical. But the question is to understand better this point, because I was very fascinated with the whole story, right? Because that is the only person who could have actually answered your question. And we even asked him, and he was kind of not really open about these things either, because even if he recognized there was something that he had lost in the process, he complained about, in fact, with the fate of certain things. But at the same time, he was the only person we estimated. And frankly, as a lone wolf like I am, likes to do things on his own all the time, that was the only person that I looked up to and said, that is a model, right? I shouldn't follow quite him because I'm a different person. But if I want to know something, I know that there is a standard that at some point I was even, reaching again, in the case of my own specific field, and that therefore I began to look also not as a peer, because he was too much of a giant in quantitative terms, and also an older person than me. But that I estimated enormously exactly because of that capacity. So my perplexity is this one, that I find it in Clausewitzian terms the most compelling. That is, again, are you willing to study every day of your life for hours and hours for a decade to actually do what eventually? To write the equivalent of a doctoral work that provides you with that kind of qualitative methodical application and in fact acknowledgement of the broader problem, also heuristically, how it's useful to do that or not, and all this, by the way, without the support, the formal support, the the concrete support of also all the in fact the I mean, universities exist also in a physical sense. There you have the professors, you have the libraries, you have the place where you go in order to, you have the money, by the way, right? You're paid if you want an article. How many, like for me it was a problem, like COVID saved in part my research because they digitalized all the articles that should have gone literally out for months and months just to get. Instead they got hundreds of them. Just, are you willing just to do that? Are you willing just to get hundreds, if not thousands of articles, of books, of whatever, and to read them, to start to integrate in that fashion? To what end also, right? Just for the understanding, and what are you actually going to do with that understanding, right? Are you going to sell it somewhere? Or do you want to create your own, I don't know, do you want to make podcasts? Do you want to become maybe, a private teacher? What do you want to do with it? That question is fundamental because it may seem trivial, but again, there is no mechanism that provides you with that same level of development if you're not pressured enough. So never see the academy in this sense as just the guys who know how to make the chemistry done by itself. It's just an illusion. It's always about very, very, very hard work, because there is nothing that the human mind as such, wherever it is in the world, cannot achieve if it is pressured enough, if it is determined enough, if it has a specific purpose. And this is it, right? So the second part of the question is, and I would say this before passing to the second part of the question, that is, again, I've never met a person, except maybe that one, that also had some shortcoming at some levels that I wish I had tested more to understand more, but let's say that actually achieved this. Nobody, right? The most interesting persons I did meet in my life were professors, but even with them, I understood that even their professional skills, their experience was not enough to understand certain things, right? So that's why I passed to the second part of the question, because it's more like, how do I do it, right? What should I do? Well, so this may be even harder and discouraging than it seems, but again, this is what you should be worth doing if you really want to get that understanding. So, first of all, I think a very solid cultural background is necessary of some sort, right? If your entire scholastic journey has been just, being glued to the phone, not doing homework, thinking that learning was kind of, useless. Well, in this case, this is not the case of the author's question, because here I understand that the history was a burning passion since a very early age, right? So, and I understand also that there is, of course, a deep attachment, because I haven't read the whole letter, but here there are some very powerful things relatively to how history shaped a person, right? So it's even more meaningful at this point to have understood through that videos that I made, those videos, a couple of videos were mentioned, the difference that may exist. This to say, I loved history ever since I can remember, but up to a certain point in my life, I had no clue I would become a historian, right? So I guess that this is also important, because it's not just history per se, or also the motivations why you learn history at the beginning, right? Many people do it for identity reasons, for example, and I also bought into that at the beginning, but it was more than that. To me, it was literally about the curiosity of it, and the curiosity to understand the world as a whole, right? So that history, yes, to me was important, but I've never, especially when I was younger, never revered history per se, right? I thought it was great, it was very important, and I think it was among the many things that one has to understand about this world before before, let's say, deciding that you wanted to do that is important in the early age, because a good school, a good formal primary and secondary education, and especially also an important familiar background, I guess. And one may not have these things, but they are important. That is to say, there are also geniuses that emerge from desperate situations. Maybe they found refuge in history and so on. And so those sometimes can be very motivated. It could be a meta motivation, let's say, that, for example, I don't think to possess. I mean, yes, I have deep spiritual connections with the reasons why I study history, also because of my family and the things. But let's say, again, I'm much more easygoing than I just do the thing. I don't think too much about that, right? Because to me, maybe it's normal. And I didn't have ever to ask myself why I was doing it, right? I just liked it, which is very, very important in my case, because if I had had to force myself to doing it, would have been a very different thing. I did this with other stuff, right? I started studying something else at some point in my life, so and I bailed out because I didn't like it, right? Or at least I liked it, but I realized it wasn't for me. Because everything is useful, but you should have that broader understanding. So again, I don't know here. I'm giving a lot of things. I'm leaving a lot of benefit of the doubt. So if I make any punctualization, it's not because of I'm thinking about the author of the question, what he wrote me and say, but the question is more complex than it seems, right? It may be what is exactly history in your view, right? Because many people, history is either a story, and in fact, the fact that I struck you with that video may be the point. That is to say, it's a method. It's which I give for granted. Okay, that at this point, right? You know that history is a method, and even before. But let's say the actual reason. It is the positive application that makes you understand why that is a method, and it is everything. And it's not just an amount of knowledge scattered like that, but the way you build it through that method, and the method, so that this method is the central element of it all. May not be that powerfully outlined until you make that kind of broader assessment, such as I was doing in that video, for example, in the Battle of Total War series, that it was more of a methodological video rather than even talking about the video game, right? Now, because I think I was even saying banal things. In fact, that's how few I consider actually the quality of what I'm saying in that regard. This greater having the habit of reading, for example, reading things that are not even related to history, which is hard not to find because everything is part of history. But let's say reading literature. To me, literature was fundamental. I've never been actually a huge reader. Never. Like that, I got a bit of bulimia at some point. But you need also to really to taste the book. Quite almost literally meant, meaning that there are certain books that take time to be assimilated, right? You can't just read them because you say, today I read 800 pages, so I feel better about myself, having read this book. Yeah, there are bad books that you can't kind of read even like that, but the idea is that great classics of literature, having also an understanding of what canon is, of what the classics are and why they are classics, right? This is something we don't teach kids anymore, right? This is naturally built, acquired, but understanding, in fact, correctly and proportionately the values of civilizational output throughout history and going back to them is quite important. For example, I'm very honest about this. I lack, importantly, classical Greek knowledge. I have, of course, approached that time. I've even made videos about that, but let's say I realized that my education, I lack a lot of elements from there that I should have had, even though I studied ancient philosophy a lot, also the Greek word, etc. But in terms of historiographical work, sometimes I'm that deficient that it's almost disturbing to me. there are also different backgrounds. Of course, it's difficult to acquire that sense of universality that should be the sap of such scientific rigor, because it makes you understand things from a possibly ever less biased point of view, intentionally. But and it's possible to draw force also from this bias, right? Because that's what effectively makes our own motivation. But as long as we get through the resistance and therefore we refine ourselves, we understand better how much there is out there, that of course that exhausts us, right? That it makes us realize that it's impossible to actually learn everything, and that we have to be humble and objective in that, because that's the only reason why eventually you get like that. It does take a lot of work. History of philosophy for me was also very important. Since high school, I studied it for 3 years. Then I made took some other classes at university, which I didn't want to, because I really wanted to study just history, but also they were important. And so having this languages, right? When you're a historian, you have to accept that you cannot work seriously on the sources if you don't know the original languages. You don't know how to translate them properly. This may be also a huge problem, especially considering that we don't, sometimes not even PhDs in the West today, I don't know, as medievalists are able to translate Latin autonomously. And so that gives you properly an idea of how low our scientific standards are collapsing. That is, it's not because it's Latin or it's another language, it's because, everybody who has a progressive historical understanding understands that without Latin you cannot study essentially half of Western history. So the question is, and not by studying it, I mean not understanding it, right? And this may seem astonishing, but the question is, it's real, right? If you start still finding renowned scholars, medieval warfare, etc., that still even can't translate Latin well, or even vernacular, like if I were to for example, in my study, had to learn, or approach at least, one learning out of scratch, and completely on my own, by the way, and the other, even though I knew the modern language, by the way, and the other kind of starting from zero. I had to learn 2 medieval vernaculars, right, that do not come from, were not my own. So, again, how far are you willing to take that? Because these things have a cost. Again, so it should be a constant improvement. If we're talking about strictly here, we're talking about the question, again, as we were saying before, poses a broadly historical problem. I would say just learning the scientific method, that's it, and exercising, right? It should just be an enormous amount of theory and a more enormous amount of practice in everything. You can't really do the one requires in the other, and it can't be substituted in any way, right? But if we're talking about military history, that's what I did. The question was always, okay, I could read a book, I could read even literature. This year, for example, I began to reread some Russian literature that I wanted. It had barely anything to do with what I study, but I wanted to, because I thought it was morally empowering. I thought that I needed that at that point. I thought I needed to space with my mind somewhere out of what I had been into for years. You have to be willing to sacrifice your own interests in the process of this research, right? You have to be willing to sacrifice. If you don't sacrifice, you can't attain the thing. My path, quite simply, I could make another video to explain it better, but was to gather, first of all, an enormous amount of works, properly books. I have an enormous amount. Of course, I haven't read them all, or not even nearly to finishing or having health. I will not leave enough. Right, having 11,000 books and making the calculation, realizing that you will not leave enough to read them all, makes you perfectly aware of how limited our time, how qualitative, and how much morally driven we should be, right, about that. Because you can literally visualize the fact that all those stupid files that you have there in a list, and that watch you like saying, why haven't you read us yet? You will not read before you're dead. So that is to say, an object has more power than you, and but it's a trick. It's a perspective. Of course, you will never learn even a minimal part of what you would like to learn in your life. And at that point, you should also ask yourself, do I really want to do it? That is, what should be my life about? If you visualize it in that way, you get motivated or you leave, right? Because if you have a real reason, you will follow the thing. If you don't, you need to do enough, to do something that might have not been maybe even enough proper, but it would have been something enough for others to follow in your to capitalize upon your work, right? It's like my videos. To me, they kind of suck, even though I realize I say interesting things at some level. But they suck because, in my opinion, if I had to do my best, I wouldn't do these things, right? I do this as a good enough thing, right? That I'm kind of content, like most things in life, right? We can not achieve perfection, theoretically because we can't, and practically because we can't, meaning that still there is a divide between the two things that is normal to even to accept. Like, being humble is part of the game, but also being ambitious should be more. That is, if this is how limited we are, how worth are we to do more? And how can we show it to others, right? It's mostly like, of course, studying warfare helps you because it shows you the stories of people who, did things that for most of us now is almost not humanly possible. That instead shows you that they are human. That's our humanity. That's how much we could achieve individually, even in terms of self-sacrifice, and that we're not habituated to think like anymore, right? So I got all this amount of books that I had for a sort of even treasuring need/passion, or I just like to have them because, of course, it's not about much just reading them all. It's also and obviously about being able to access them, right? I don't know. This thing can be quite expensive, as you understand. There are ways to do it in more, economical ways, but it's kind of needed. That is, if you don't have access to knowledge, you cannot even start to do it, right? So I struggle sometimes with, I realize that I struggle for finding the information, but I really see that most people instead struggle with properly being able to frame the information in the first place. So that's why I make all this preparatory and theoretical approach, because I believe that that's what actually makes the difference, not even whether you have that information or not. In any case, for years, if it had depended on me, like if I hadn't gone through in fact, my university career, I would have probably read an enormity of these books, right? I would have just read those because of pure pleasure, and I would have immediately felt the need, as I'm doing with Schwerpunkt, to go out there and to talk about that, things I knew. So, in a sense, spending them in a market, and so earning from it in return something. In a sense, the bachelor, the master, the doctoral research, etc., stopped this process. So I don't know how it would be, because most of it, of all this time, I had to study something else, and I did keep reading other things in the meanwhile, but it was not as structured and as continuous as I would have liked. And the younger you are, especially if you're younger than 24, that's in my opinion what should be doing all the time. I don't know even how this starts from adolescence, because of course at that point you absorb everything like a sponge, but you may still not have gotten to the realization that is needed to push you in a more scientific sense. But I believe the younger the better. Even as a child, it's important to read. I have always kind of read, but not so much as I would like, right? Too many years spent with video games. There were also another interesting field of application, because that's in part where I developed even some interests and awareness and will to know more. So I'm not saying, but everything should be in the right balance, and especially reading should be everything, right? It can even be like, you don't have to necessarily read books, but it's obvious that There are huge differences between reading just Wikipedia articles, which again, I'm not saying that this is the case, but or internet blogs or watching Schwerpunkt videos or all these things. But you say books really are something else because they're structured in a different way, right? In a much more complex way that exercises you to think in a more complex way, and very often they're unsatisfactory, right? Over time, the more I read, the more I had difficulties to actually find a pleasant read. Also because I get very anxious when I'm reading something and I want to finish immediately. I don't like to read ever, like taking 2 months to read a book. It's complete. I don't understand it because my mind wants to work hard on that immediately and to acquire it. And so also it's also a matter of time how much other things you can read. So I'm a bit frenetic in this sense, but I must say that having gone through that, having written thesis, having developed my my skills through that other path, I must, and having kept reading every once in a while these things, I guess that what I've turned into is mostly like now I'm a maker myself. That is, if I need some to talk about, like in my videos, about a specific topic, I like to gather as many information as I can, or maybe for the sake of the videos less than I would, because otherwise it would be even like much longer than they normally are. But let's say gathering information a bit from all the books I have about the same topic, and hopefully managing to assemble that knowledge in that synthesis way that I can spend to create essentially an original content, right? So having been exposed to this kind of activity, now I know where to find the information I need, how to find it fast, how to evaluate it, how to lay it out, and this came just through practice and practice and practice. I've been making 1,200 videos at this point. So even just talking about it was very important, but I realized that, for example, if I had spent the same time writing articles rather than making videos, I would have a different mind, maybe not necessarily even a worse one, actually, even though Schwerpunkt was possibly much more important for me than even my doctoral thesis. I must confess that, but I realized that also without it, also Schwerpunkt would have not been the same thing. But still, this tells you how important it is to cultivate your interests privately, and especially to follow the like, if you want to do it, if you feel that you want to do that thing, you shouldn't even think about whether that makes you earn something. You just do it, because if you're good at it and you think to make, which is not a way to determine with certainty whether you will make it or not, but just if there are chances for you to succeed in that field, the best are if you actually pursue your actual dreams, and of course if you work on them, right? And if not those people who pursue dreams and eventually get tired, get bored with them after like 1 week, and they pass to something else, because you should be aware of why this thing is important to you and why you're doing it and why this is so meaningful to you. And I give you that, yes, it's sometimes difficult to find the motivation, but for what you love, there shouldn't be such problem. So reading a lot of those books and being able to assess essentially whether they're, for example, good or bad, right? If you already know if they're going to bore you the way they're written or not. There are certain things in book structures and information that you just understand at the first glance whether they're useful or not for you. As for many other things in life, you that discriminatory capacity is crucial in the SAP for civilization. You need that, right? So another thing that is important, I would never discard, is to confront yourself with others, because in my experience, like, I got through so many arguments. I mean, maybe not so many, but they were so impacting in a sense that they really changed my worldview and opinions and ways of coping with that, because the attrition with others forces you to recognize that you may be wrong, right? Which is the greatest thing in a sense that you can do about yourself when you actually understand why it is the case. not trying to be convinced by something else, something you don't really believe, because to uniform yourself to the art, but say thinking and thinking and thinking over again how you can defend a position up to the point that you realize maybe that position is untenable because the premises are wrong, and therefore you should change your same view in the same way. And this can be even the most difficult thing in a sense, but even there, through experience in such things, you can't have it. Unfortunately, there are very few places where you can have this kind let's say of discussions, because most people are just not there to learn anything, nor they are so valuable. You may have there is a moment where you feel inadequate being in one place. You say, okay, I'm already beyond here. I don't have to learn anything. And so that's also why those stages in education are important, because it's not about, again, having gotten a quantity of it, but having realized at the end that you were wasted for continuing at that level, and therefore you need to pass to another one to improve. It's a work of improvement. Right. If we talk about, strictly speaking, the art of war, what is that we have to read from these books and how? Yes, there should be some fundamental reads, I guess, also the classics in the same military library or all these things, but also in there, never being fooled by scholarship per se, always being very, very open and honest with yourself, first of all, and saying, why is this? Okay, because at the end of the day, history is about this. What do you want to know, right? History should be about knowing, let's say, finding an answer to something that we don't understand, right? This is the base of everything. What you're doing there is exactly that. So, with the art of war, what you must necessarily do is to understand a lot of things, of course, by the same experience, but making the following exercise, that is studying from the sources continuously, full time, campaigns and battles all the time. You can you see, reading a book about a certain battle is not as studying the sources of that battle in order to reconstruct the battle by yourself. You can read a tremendous biography. You can love a book. It can be great even just to access information. You can love it for many reasons. But where most people stop in order to eventually not getting that kind of rigor that is required for an autonomous understanding is where the reality, let's say, where the reality begins and the scholarly opinion finishes. And in most threads, you don't really have that indication. In most threads, people do not show you where they got their information from. They talk at a distance. They say, in this work, this verse says this and that. And have you read that work? If the answer is no, you're basically trusting this guy's opinion. It doesn't matter that this person is an expert. You're not in that person's mind. Even if you let's say, if you read the thing yourself, you would get another, not much understanding, probably another impression, other ideas, that is to say, about a certain passage in a work. You would get an aspect that another person wouldn't. And we all are like that. So the greatness of this method of studying battles and campaigns from the sources forever, it is difficult. It's maybe the let's say, that's exactly at that point. You can spend years reading, but you may not spend equally at the same time making that kind of research. I mean, even for the first time needed to get all the sources of a battle is an enormous work, right? Of course, the ancient ones maybe not, but let's say I remember for my master thesis, when for the first time, actually, I got acquainted with the complexity of what a 13th century, even just a 13th century battle was in terms of sources, where to find them. That is literally where to find them published, where to find them, how to translate them, and being sure that those are all of them, right? That's the thing that historian also has to do. Like, if you really want to answer that question, you have to either answer it seriously or you don't, right? You can't say, okay, there are maybe 50 sources talking about this, but I just search for 30. right? It's only when you have collected all those 50 sources that you will be able to say, okay, maybe the important ones are just 5, but at least I know that they are, because I've looked at all the sources that exist. And if that's literally all what we know about that that event, at least properly from an evidential, like from the direct evidence of it, and then we could know lots of other things that could help us frame that. And that's also why the diachronic and comparative perspective here comes handy, as we'll explain now. Well, at least I am sure that there is nothing beyond that I should consider, which is already a big accomplishment, because of course with history we can do it at certain points where we're lucky. As a medievalist, this happens more often than to a modernist or to a contemporaneist. So there are very different ways to study these things. I personally wouldn't have any idea how to study like a contemporary war. Like, I have literally no idea. Like, meaning, of course, I know that there is all a literature about these things, and you should go look at how do you search this for these sources. Of course, it's very easy to find, even on the internet, just a book that talks about the topic and provides you with further bibliographical reference. That's as easy as it is, right? It's just that most people will not do it, because most people won't even buy the book. Even those who buy it stop to that, and even if they're interested in bibliography, they will not actually buy it or read it all. Why again? Because there is no motivation. Instead, you should be motivated to do that. And even for that exercise, I don't know, think about the Vietnam War. Nobody can know the Vietnam War. Like, it's not that there is a person today that knows that. There is not, because it's impossible to do it. Like, either, of course, there is a way to know it approximately. Of course, there's plenty of experts and scholars. There's a lot of studying on it. But let's say, at that point, either you concentrate just on that, or you cannot study the rest of war. Instead, that reconstruction that I was talking about, why is it useful? Because it presents you with a pattern that actually emerges from reality, even so imperfectly in terms of truth from the evidence that we have, but that when we got, first of all, we know how to work methodologically. We know how to what to expect from a battle, or from a campaign, how to reason tactically or strategically, which is also another thing that is not easy to do, because the first time you study it, if you have never studied von Clausewitz, or if you not have any progressed experience, it's not easy to understand even tactics or strategy, right? It may not be entirely clear, not just how these people fought and commanded their armies, but properly how, like, what's the logic of their moves in that specific sense. It made, I mean, for example, the political background, social background, even there may not be explicitated, because it's normal, by the way, in some normal in the sources. So that's why you need also an enormous amount of background for that. It has to be philosophical, linguistic, scientific. You have to be able to read ballads. You have to be able to study, engineering or archaeology. Let's say you cannot understand a period without context, and of course, so that's something you can only measure yourself, how much you need to know that. And unfortunately, even there, it requires an enormous commitment, because again, I guess most people I've seen on the internet, whatever, they're just content with saying, okay, more or less I know what this is because I've read a bunch of books about that. It doesn't really work like that, unfortunately, because again, we're mostly told things by other people, but we don't make the effort to do it ourselves. So it's obvious that for everything I write, I don't have the greatest. There is always a moment where the historian says this is enough, right? The historian stops. We cannot know everything before, but this approximate stopping point should be still calibrated. For example, on the accomplishment of historiography, like, you cannot study something seriously if you haven't even read all not just the primary sources, but literally all what is being written already about that. And that can be a huge challenge. Sometimes, again, for doctoral research, sometimes it would take the same amount of time of the research spent exclusively to cover all the historiography that exists today on it. And this, for example, affects a big deal, even the way the same researchers are chosen, because sometimes something is too much, but maybe you have a good idea about that, and you just maybe are not motivated enough, or you're even discouraged by others. It happened to me. And instead, I realized I was right and made the thing in spite of that, but I also went against the problem not being understood, because nobody was used to what I did. Even though nobody actually denied that it was well done, but they just hadn't gotten there themselves, and therefore they had literal problems to understand what the heuristic value of it, because they had no perspective where to frame it. So this work naturally takes time. It takes your own. That's why books or other reads are important and to be constant, because they provide you with that inspiration, even, right? You can't even factually be taught how to choose a topic of interest. Again, what do you want to really study history for? In that case, for knowing the Polish Lithuanian army organization, well, I personally got information there from other books written by other people. I'm not an expert. There's no rigor there. There is just maybe my synthesis capacity, the fact that I more or less interpreted certain things in a way that I think are correct, given the other things I studied at the time, that I managed to frame the broader picture in a way that things I said made sense, so that there could be like in fact, that link between a person's background and the specific data there that was given, that was something new, so that it could be more easily framed. That's what makes the thing. And this continuous studying of campaigns and the engagements and so on is fundamental, because it presents you with a kind of a universal pattern of what war is, right? The proof of, let's say, of those who say the proof of military historical literacy, let's call it in this way, is to pretend that there is a way war has ever been done that was intrinsically, essentially, and almost metaphysically different from another time. That is, the greatest criticism towards von Clausewitz, unsurprisingly, in fact, moved from these bases. That is exactly not having done the amount of work von Clausewitz did to understand certain things, and not even the effort to read, sometimes literally, his work, because reading, learning, studying, and understanding are all different things. And sometimes, literally, even the so-called great critiques of von Clausewitz literally neither read what he wrote. And I'm perfectly sure of that. I think Keegan never read von Clausewitz for real, because you can't say certain things otherwise. But again, people buy those books because, again, it's an authority criterion, which frankly doesn't mean much in the realm of science, because if you surrender to authority, means that you give up on understanding what the thing is. And so you're basically saying, okay, I will not do the effort. I will trust someone else just because other people do, which is not really definitely a good scientific position. Because of course war has some essentials that make you understand what this is in general. Most people presume that by starting from the details you can acquire the expertise. Instead, like in every formal education, you should actually start from the essentials, from the basis, right? So since our educational systems are fucked up enough, this doesn't happen anymore, and so we grow kids without those essentials, and then we pretend them to hyper specialize in something, because they become machines. Factually, they're not given properly an autonomy or a healthy critical capacity to say, okay, now I will do a thing myself because I willingly and freely let's say join into this activity because I see where this goes and what to do with the thing. No, I'm just told what to do and I'll do it, right? Because otherwise, I don't eat, right? This is the new logic. Of course, everything goes lost in that way. So in military historical terms, instead, the realization that war is made essentially from the standpoint of a human dimension, it is essentially a struggle between moral forces that reciprocally influence each other, is not even seen anymore as the starting point. It's all about, I don't know, most people are fixated with the technology. They think that technology fundamentally is how war works. Others with economics, others with logistics, others with I don't know, even national identity, all these things. So obviously this has no sense in the realm of the scientific understanding, because we know without even having to explain why that there is not a decisive element in it, and that pretending that there is one is basically cutting away all what you need to make that thing fit as a concept. So denying reality, discarding a part of reality is exactly the one that you need instead to understand what happens, and going and selling the product, right? A lot of history production today is fueled by the gullibility of people. How much, of course, the least you know, the more you're going to buy in that regard. And it is exactly that drive that makes you, let's say, understanding that you can't stop there. We are always responsible of our ignorance, right? We cannot eliminate that because we're all terribly ignorant. But the question is that if you really care about doing something, we are the only ones who can learn the thing. So there is a moment in which you reach a point for whichever reason in your standards, and then you decide it's enough, right? In the scientific field, this normally happens where you set something beyond what anybody else has said by that point, which I personally did my doctoral thesis, and I'm proud of, even though it's something very confined just to essentially one aspect of tactics in early 14th century Western European warfare, right? So it's not like you would say 4 years for that. Yes, 4 years for that, and that's how heavy it is. How much you need to know, even to think to be able to write something decent, which I think I could have written much better with much more information, right, and so on. Right, in the rest of, and it's a matter of standards and moral force. In the rest of the world, it's like, I mostly stop wherever if I have to, I want to eat a sandwich, I will do it, right? So there's nothing wrong in eating sandwiches, and I'm actually a great fan of that. But at the same time, the work shouldn't stop there, right? Or shouldn't stop whenever it becomes too difficult or you want to do something else. Right? And if you do that constantly, the result can be, I presume, attainable outside the realm of professional academia. Yes, why not? The point again is what are you doing that for, and so how much are you driven consequently, and also with which checks and with which let's say with which control. Again, because we can't really save ourselves by ourselves. We need somebody who maybe even wrongly points out that there may be something wrong in our work, so that we even reinforce our understanding that in that work, right? So I don't know where this leads. You see, I've been doing this from it's been a decade or so. So it's not very long, right? I presume that in order to become and I've seen other people doing better, maybe with less kind of generalistic approach in that sense already, among my colleagues and so on. But I tell you what, it's hardly standard in nature, right? It really depends on what you study with which standards. Sometimes we tend to evaluate. For example, I never underestimate people, because I know that when I'm wrong, it makes me feel better, right? And by default, it spurs me to do better at the same time. So that's the kind of attitude I have. But having seen just a little bit how things really are in this environment, and a bit also internationally, I am greatly disappointed at it. So I wish that people learned on their own. I wish there was a greater awareness about these because they are essentially scientific problems. Let's be honest. They're not even about history, because history has a particular way of, making, science. But let's say it's at the end of the day, the standard should be the same, right? It's just a bit more difficult because there are less firm points where to start from, and so that's also why history helps so much to grow. because it doesn't quite depend on anyone but your own judgment. And that's also another thing that we are stripped of normally when we think of history, if we think politics, that as if, there were, as if we could even reach an absolute understanding at the point of, at that point, in fact, detaching ourselves from reality and pretending that that is going to be good. That's how disaster comes, right? And how much this is true, actually, in certain environments, such as, I don't know, well, but even you would be surprising how true this is in the history of a people. For example, if you are, if you are in a totalitarian regime, how deep and really horrifying, and say you can't take away is the scar, is the wound, is in the scar of being taught to deny reality by default, right? And there was a time, in fact, in which there were totalitarianisms that were imposed, and that the totalitarianisms can always come back, even though not in the way we imagine, because history always changes. But this is exactly the point. The moment in which people start denying reality in its complexity and in the acknowledgement, of course, most of all, they don't know anything about that, and that's what I try to tell myself all the time. They start doing bad things, right? You cannot, you see, totalitarian regimes are not working because of the regime. They're working because somebody supports the regime. So, in other words, it's always the people's fault. Always. Right? In other words, they get what they deserve, right? And that's also takes out a lot of moral problems, even militarily speaking, sometimes, because even though, you wish that it was that easy, it's not really. But the idea that, you're, for example, told, almost a last effort, right? Or you're doing well, you're not letting you knowing about the external world. This is exactly what, paradoxically, we are telling ourselves in a still a free society, because of the lack of motivation, moral force, right? Look at what is happening culturally now. It's exactly what we're being told. Reality doesn't matter. It only matters what you feel. There doesn't have to be any, effort in things we do, because we are all more special and we will deserve something that somebody else has to give us. Authority shouldn't be there. Discipline shouldn't be there. Don't worry. And this is actually the best way to bring people under, like slaves, because they have factually no individual worth anymore. Like a person who is not able to assert a moral or scientific or rational position is objectively worthless in the path of civilization. It's exactly, and sadly, the people that we have crushed under the heels of civilization. Not because they deserved it in an absolute sense, but simply because they didn't have the capacity to make it, and they were doing the wrong thing. Or the thing that didn't work for them to remain alive, right? And so this is exactly the opposite philosophy that we're told nowadays, right? That essentially denying the value and the superiority of civilization has become a way for the individual to feel less challenged about his or her own shortcomings, so that you can keep this individual down as, again, somebody morally irrelevant, because you can tell him or her whatever you want them to do without even making an understanding that is a thing. In totalitarian regimes, people didn't understand they were being exploited, even if they lived a completely shit life as slaves, under the threat of deportation, terror, the most abject moral and material misery. They were thinking that the government was doing their own good, right? And that's exactly what we're turning again. And this is kind of normal path. We're at the end of a phase of enrichment that benefited a large pool of people. Now we're contracting once again, and the elites are coming back to be more more powerful, and the individuals are losing in importance in themselves. We have already seen this, and the these are things that represent themselves historically in different ways, but this wave of kind of Gnosticism, nominalism, and other kind of heresies that popular are exactly the product of are exactly normal, right? It's also funny that these people believe that they are somewhat special. They have achieved who knows what in terms of, culturally speaking. They're exactly a copy of what has always been eventually the succumbing side's point that eventually didn't have any moral consistency and was taken out by the most qualitative elements of the community, and so and brought under to work for them to be exploited by it. So these things are evident in a world that that even at the top levels of that kind of education seems to have fallen at the point of letting essentially do whatever you want. Right? So, as banal as it is, I think that there is no other way to motivate yourself regarding to this thing but by studying history itself. I believe that's the fuel. That's the more you know and the more you realize what needs to be done. After all, it's very simple. So that's why forcing yourself in that kind of understanding may be difficult, but surely can be rewarding by itself. And I think that, yes, spending a life reading historical, it may not be enough to actually get to that qualitative level, because it's a matter, but making an effort, right? Setting, let's say, some standards and saying, I have to literally make a work today, not just enjoying a read. I have to literally reconstruct on the base of sources what this battle, without any external help, from my understanding of it, actually was fought. And it will be amazing how you will be able to find the shortcomings of those who have already done the thing, or the differences of the reasons why they were biased. You would say, but wait a minute. These were the people who should have actually understood what the deal was, and that's how kind of poor or unthoughtful or biased or unrefined their view was. And when you get that, I don't know whether this is just me, or I believe it's a valid motive to say more, to say your own thing, that this thing is wrong here. And even when you are wrong instead, the fact that you will be passionate and motivated to have been brought to even make to say the thing out loud, maybe even being corrected, or maybe not, because this is also what happens. That's how those people could write those things in the first place. Will teach you how how dreadfully complex reality is, and how you can never be content factually with what you have. Because at the end of the day, it's also about improving your own life. Right? If you think that your life was always... It's like the same thing was written in the message. I thought I knew history, I knew it well, it was my great passion, etc. I just listened to this random video on YouTube, and I was blown by that. Because, say, how is it possible? Like, I had never thought of these things, or I felt so, like, I don't know here what the feeling concretely stood from. Like, because here it says, I thought on that point and found my own understanding lacking. That's exactly the point. It's all motivated by lack of understanding. It's all motivated by you want to know how the thing then is. And if you are not motivated to find it out, and obviously you go nowhere. But even when you find somebody telling you the thing and you don't see what's the mechanism, you don't see what the sources are, what are the bases for that statement, you should be brought to bring it forward and say, I want to know what that connection is. I want to know whether this person is right or not. And again, it probably sounds very theoretical as an advice, right? I cannot say specifically how to do it, because I could even spend 6 hours telling you all how it is for me. But I like, again, the most important aspect of this all is the concept in itself. And it's all about the motivation. What do you want to do this for, and why, and what is that it is at that point needed for. So I realize it's an unsatisfactory question, because again, I know that factually I cannot prove you this until you do it. And this is what I've been telling all the time. Again, those videos I made, I didn't think they were so special. I thought they were kind of normal in the sense of given maybe the things I normally ruminate on, but I don't like, I'm glad that at least this sparked like a question, like, you know, if this was interesting, because if there was that lack of understanding, the idea that I could provide you with is the reason why I'm making these videos in the first place. It's exactly the same reason. I know it sounds arrogant sometimes, you could say, wow, you think you're better than us. No, I don't. I don't, right? I just know that it's likely that maybe I know something more than the average, which is not difficult at all, especially in military history, considering how disregarded it is. And that's it. It's just a perspective, right? It's just in relative terms. It's just like a doctor knows better how to fix somebody than I do. That's what I do, and and I wish also I knew how to do it much better, so that I hope to improve in that field as well. And yeah, yeah, I could think of other things, but I guess these videos are too long by themselves already, and so I will keep coming on the topic, of course, because I'm interesting more people about these. I'm creating kind of an awareness about such issues, and I believe they have some kind of validity, right? They are positive enough to be expandable. Well, anyhow, for now I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.